Okay, so we're recording. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have Matt Muchler with us from the psychology department giving a talk today titled, Are We All Neurotic? And today I do feel like the answer to that is yes, but we're diving into the role of reported and perceived personality traits on the student-professor working relationships. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great, thanks. In typical professor fashion, I think I have shared my screen correctly. Are you seeing the PowerPoint? Okay, great. So, just wanted to appreciate the font on that one. There's a couple things I'll be doing today. I'll skip right down to the agenda. I do this thing where I make a PowerPoint, then decide I'm just going to do it differently. So I'll do a couple things. One is to cover some of the psychology stuff behind the study that we did, just so that we all are talking about the same thing. And then we'll talk about the study and about what it means. But I want to acknowledge right up front that this was originally a student research project that my student Steph Nolan did. She just graduated. I said class of 2020. She graduated in December, but close enough. For part of her E360, that we actually would have been in Chicago presenting in May if the world hadn't exploded. So we did a virtual poster and nobody came, and it was cool, but we did it. So I just wanted to give that context to it, that this was her idea. We worked on this together in the fall of 2019. And of course, we're going to end with mimosas if you brought your own, especially, I think that's what Reg has. So two concepts, broad concepts I want to talk about. One is working alliance. The other one is the personality structure. So the idea of working alliance is something that comes out of the clinical world, counseling and therapy. And what we found in that world is that is the most important contribution that the clinician makes. The relationship we form with our clients is the thing we do that has the most relationship to outcome. The most variance explained in outcome is explained by the relationship we have with clients. And the same idea can be applied to teaching. Now, there's a lot more that we provide as professors that makes learning outcomes happen, but also not as much as we think. Most of that work, just as in therapy, has to happen on the student's end, often not in the classroom. But we have seen it in educational research, the strong working relationship or strong rapport or alliance or whatever phrasing people use predicts positive student outcomes. Now, a lot of those studies look at grades, which we all know is a flawed measure of learning. Some of the other ones in specific subject areas have looked at learning of actual concepts. And again, this idea of strong relationship makes a difference. So, I forgot I had that there. The way you might think about the idea of relationship is it's tacky. I'm not really a fan of the language of it, but some of the talking you'll see about how we should be teaching as university professors, this idea of guide on the side, not a sage on the stage, which just the names of those make me want to gag. I like the idea though, like the guide on the side, this is a thing we're doing together. The sage on the stage is like I'm the smart guy up there talking on an elevated platform, and you're going to listen and take notes and all that. And you know, some other day we could talk about how we actually need to do both of those things, but that's not the point today. The guide on the side thing is really emphasizing relationship, and so I just want to give that frame to you if you've been going to other teaching and learning conferences or workshops. So what my student wanted to do is she noticed just in conversation with her peers, they were talking about classes and professors they liked and honestly professors they hated. And there's this one professor that she and some of her friends really hated. And somebody else was like, oh, that's my favorite professor. And so it made her, well, why is it so different? Why do we think this? And so she wanted to look at personality and how this works out. And so that's how we all got started looking at these concepts. So I want to talk about personality a bit. This is the psychology lesson. You can take at DelVal an entire course on personality. And that would be really interesting for the professor to see a bunch of other professors show up. I'm not even sure who's teaching it this semester. I should probably know that, but that's okay. Lots of different ways to conceive of personality. One of the most popular and one of the more broadly accepted is the Big Five model. And so I've got the 5 personality traits there, and we're going to go into more detail on these in a minute. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Students love this because it's got a mnemonic device that spells ocean if you read it up and down, which also helps me remember it. The idea being that on each of these dimensions, we have a degree that we are high or low in openness, conscientiousness, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the mode of personality we wanted to look at in this study, just because we thought it would encompass a lot of the things that affect how we perceive each other, and a lot of the things that might come out in a classroom from a professor in the way they run their course. We know from research that's out there, students like instructors that are high on openness, high on conscientiousness, who are extroverted, and don't like folks who are low on agreeableness and high on neuroticism. And because, as some of you know, I am a big nerd, I tried to think of, well, who are some professors out in the literature world or the entertainment world we can think of? And so here's my Harry Potter reference for the day. Yeah, everybody at Hogwarts hates Professor Snape. Well, Professor Snape is a great poster child for neuroticism. And we'll talk about what these each mean in a second. And he's very low on agreeableness, right? Then we can talk about in personality, the opposite of agreeableness is antagonism. He's very antagonistic. Students don't like him. Professor McGonagall on his, I guess it's his left, our right, high on conscientiousness, high on agreeableness. Agreeableness isn't just, oh, they're nice, but it's they are kind, and students like her better, right? And as we all know, the real world is like movies. So the Big Five are presented as these categories, the whole oceans thing, but we want to look at each one as a continuum, right? And of course, they have the words used to describe these personality types are laden with value. Yeah, we can look at some of those first 4 are good, but neuroticism is bad. And that is not the way we look at these, right? That the way to look at this is we all fall somewhere on the high or low end of these continuum, and that makes us who we are. And there are ways that each point on these scales could be a strength for us, and ways they could be a weakness or present challenges to us. And so we have to kind of, as psychologists, as people looking at studies like this, to get past that gut reaction a lot of people have. Oh my God, I'm neurotic, that's bad. Let me tell you, when we presented this research at the Day of Scholarship, a lot of faculty came up to me and said, I'm not neurotic. Okay. But it's not necessarily bad, right? There are times that having higher neuroticism can be helpful, can be protective, can be a benefit. And so try to avoid, even with the language, try to avoid falling into that one end of this is good and the other end is bad. So let's look at each dimension. And the first one we'll look at is the dimension of openness. And so we can see openness on one side of the spectrum, closeness, which I've decided yesterday was a word, on the other side of the spectrum. And let's look at some of the traits, right? So if we look at research over the past, 40 to 50 years, the traits you see, people who are high on openness have high curiosity, they have a very wide range of interests, they're independent, and they can be eccentric. Now, eccentric can be bad, it can be good, right? You can be high on openness. Oh, it sounds good, I'm very open. That can turn out to be a little unfocused sometimes, right? So not just like nothing is necessarily bad, there isn't necessarily all good either. Our personality is what it is what we look like. We think about closeness. This is a practical person. This is a person with narrow interest. They like routines. They're more conventional. So I want to highlight for a second narrow interest. We all have very specialized degrees and wrote dissertations on very specialized areas and research, maybe not very specialized areas, but pretty narrowed areas. Faculty tend to have narrow interest, and that's what we're supposed to have, right? That's not a bad thing, at least academically. So again, we want to avoid kind of the value judgments on who's open or who's closed and what that means. So we can look at conscientiousness and lacking direction. I think we're all in the right age range to recognize Gilligan and the professor. So the professor came to mind. I don't even know. He probably had a name. I don't know his name. As conscientious, right? He works hard. He's dependable. He's really organized. The phrase there, high control. Control is another one of these value-laden words. We often see control as a bad thing in terms of professors who are too controlling, parents who are too controlling. Of course, too controlling, too much of anything is bad. Not enough control is also negative, right? So high control can be self-control. It can be the way they manage a group or a classroom. This can be a positive thing. Lacking direction, this is a person who tends to be impulsive, is maybe careless in their work, can be disorganized, and also can be spontaneous, right? These things can be positive. Even when you see a lot of the traits that we find in the research for the low on conscientiousness, the lacking direction, seem to be negative. But there can be value in these. And so again, if you remember, students tend to prefer conscientious professors, people high on conscientiousness. Introversion, extroversion, Dr. Jones there. I chose him because seeking adventure comes up reliably in the extroversion research. These people tend to be outgoing, where we all kind of know what extroverts are. And we all kind of know what introverts are. We're more quiet, more reserved, keep to themselves, or more cautious. Again, one is not better than the other. They're just different ways of being in the world. In the research, this isn't the strongest thing, but students do tend to prefer extroverted professors. I can tell you just anecdotally, when I teach some personality stuff in some of my classes, I covered the MBTI, one of my classes, the INFJ and all that stuff. You probably all took it at some point. And I asked students to guess what my personality is. And they often guess that I'm extroverted because that's how they see me. That's how I am in the classroom. But nah, not really. And that'll be important as we get to it later. But that tends to be a trait that students are drawn to in terms of, oh, I am fond of this professor. So the agreeableness and antagonism. So I just watched this series. I don't know if anybody has seen Community. I would recommend, if you would like weird comedies, watching it. It will remind you a lot of DelVal. Sometimes in the good ways and sometimes not as much. So somebody who's high on agreeableness, they're very helpful, they're very trusting, they have a lot of empathy, they're very patient. As you, I'm sure, are unsurprised, students love agreeable professors. Now, that doesn't mean we just go along and give whoever you want, right? I mean, there obviously are students that like that, but that's not what agreeableness necessarily is. Antagonism, the other end of that, they're critical, uncooperative, suspicious, they're hostile. Again, all the words that we've used here to describe antagonism are negative. It's hard to take advantage of somebody who's high on antagonism because of their suspicion. And so there are ways that can be a strength for people. Again, we can't just say, oh, this person's high on antagonism, they're bad. No, not necessarily. They have predictable struggles in relationships, and their high antagonism gives them strength in other places of their life, most likely. I had to put Doc Brown from Back to the Future in here somewhere. I don't know that he's neurotic necessarily, but I love that picture. So somebody high on neuroticism, a lot of anxiety. They tend to be unhappy. They're more prone, their first reaction is more prone to be a negative emotion. And a lot of that revolves around feelings of inadequacy or of not being good enough. And here I'll relate this to the imposter phenomenon that I'm sure many of you have read about, felt. If you haven't, I'll give a talk on that some other day. This idea that I don't know that I'm good enough to be doing what I'm doing. I don't know that I belong in this profession as a professor, in a classroom, whatever. Or again, making it broader than just professors. I don't know that I belong at all. I don't know that I'm good enough. That drives a lot of neuroticism. The other end, emotional stability, somebody who's calm, who's even tempered, who's resilient. They have a pretty secure sense of self. Again, let's think about positive, negative. Somebody who is higher on neuroticism, tends to be more in tune with their emotion, tends to be more responsive to their emotion. Somebody who's high on what we'll call here emotional stability might also be cut off from their emotion. Like, again, too much can be bad, right? Even tempered. If you're even tempered to a fault, if you never have an emotional response, positive or negative, that's going to have some predictable effects on your relationships. So those are the kind of, again, I don't want to say quick and dirty, but it's too late. So the quick and dirty run through the big five. I'll point out that they're all phrased with the more positive emotion coming first, except neuroticism. I don't know why, but I'll tell you that drove us nuts through the coding process. And my best guess is neuroticism comes first because then it spells ocean. And if it starts with another E at the end of the acronym, then it doesn't work. I don't know. I don't think that's true, but seemed good. So I'll stop there for questions. If you have questions at all, feel free to interject and interrupt me. I don't have the chat window up. I'll put the chat window up, but also there's only a few of us, so I don't mind if you just say something. Apparently I can't put the chat window up when I'm sharing. All right, whatever. So let's talk about the study. I will say that we got so much more participation in this study than I expected us to. Part of that is the very persistent, let's say, personality of my my student. So she recruited through email, through classroom visits, maybe some of your classrooms, 302 students completed the survey. More than that started. A lot of people skipped too many questions to be used or just didn't finish or whatever. As is the case with DelVal, most of them were white, most of them were women. Mean age was 21, but the range was wide. I think our oldest participant was in their 50s. Professors, and here's the one that really impressed me, 85 professors participated, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, but that includes all ranks and levels. Again, as is representative of DelVal in this area, mostly white folks. Interestingly, we were evenly split between male and female, so that's notable, I guess. Mean age was about 50. I don't recall what the range was because I don't have that in front of me. So yeah, all ranks were represented. Instructor through full, tenure track, non-tenure track, tenured, not tenured, full-time adjunct. We had some of everybody that were represented in this, which was interesting to see, both that they were there to be recruited based on how we did that, and also that they participated. So that was cool. We also had students and professors across all three schools. So my big concern was like, oh, this is going to be all my psychology students saying how much they either love or hate the three of us in the psychology department. And luckily for my mental health, it turned out better than that. So we had two instrument surveys that we used. I'll just put them both up here. One is the Big Five inventory, or the BFI, which is a 5-point Likert scale. And again, I don't know how much y'all know about social science research, so if I over-explain, just throw something at me virtually. Likert scale, so you have 5 possible answers. So there'd be a statement like, I enjoy going to parties. Strongly agree, sit the fence, disagree, strongly disagree. You pick one of those, 5-point scale. One of the things we do with surveys in psych and behavioral research is we do an analysis called internal consistency, measured by Cronbach's alpha, which is really a correlation. Do people answer the questions consistently, right? So on the Big Five inventory, there are 5 subscales, right, for each dimension of personality. And so within each of those 5 subscales, we'd like all of my answers to be correlated with each other, to all of Reg's answers to be correlated with each other, and so on. And so Cronbach's alpha runs through all that for the entire sample. And what numbers you see there are kind of the average across all 5 dimensions. And they were a little bit low on the Big Five, 0.7 or thereabouts for both groups. What we want usually is internal consistency above 0.9. And we didn't get it. I think that's in part because of how dichotomous a lot of people think about these personality things are. it didn't turn out to be that big a deal, but it is big enough to name here. We also used the professor-student rapport scale, which again, a measure of the working relationship between students and their professors. And we saw more appropriate internal consistency there, 0.93 and 0.94 respectively. We also had some demographics just for sorting and learning about who these people were. The ones relevant to our discussion today are these two questions here. Who's your favorite professor? Who's your least favorite professor? And what about them made you choose them, right? So if some student was taking this and said, oh, Melissa Langston is my favorite professor. And okay, tell me what about, and of course we weren't doing it live, so just what about this professor makes them your favorites? Oh, Melissa is blah, 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 blah. Oh, Reg Hoyt is my least favorite professor. Well, what about Reg? He never shares his coffee, blah, 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 blah. Jason, you're not on my screen, but I know you're still there. I'm just not using you yet. I'll try to use you as an example later.
Sounds good. I'm waiting.
Okay, I'll save a good one for you. So here's what we did. We first, of course, recruited the students, gave them this survey because we needed their answers about who their favorite professors and least favorite professors were. We did this all online through SurveyMonkey. So they completed the survey. And because we would need to match their answers. So if, somebody said, oh, if, student number 2 said, Jason Downs, there you go. Jason Downs is my favorite professor. I needed to know that, okay, this student is student number 2 and they named Jason. So when Jason participates in my study, I have to be able to go back and take Jason's answers and associate them with that student, right? So there was a lot of random ID numbers done here so that, I couldn't tell Jason who said they were his favorite. He was their favorite. So they would take the big 5 inventory the students did to get their personality traits out there, and they took the rapport scale once for each professor that they named. So here's how I feel my relationship is with my favorite. Here it is with my least favorite. After we finished that wave of data collection, we made a big fat Excel file where we just went through, okay, here's everybody's favorites, here's everybody's least favorites, assign them all a number, and then we recruited all of you. If you were named. And so that was just an email out. And I sent emails individually so nobody would know who else was named, and that was a giant pain, but that's okay. That's research. So across the 302 students, there were 141 unique professors' names. So that means a lot of people were named more than once. And of the 141, 85 participated. So it's a 60% return rate. That's not bad. That's not bad in psych research, especially when you consider of that 141, a lot of people were adjuncts that no longer teach for us. Some of them were people that taught at some other point in that student's career and no longer were at DelVal. So again, I was very happy with an 85 people responding. Again, because I was afraid, okay, the people that know me and that are my friends and colleagues that understand psych research, they're going to be the only ones who participate. And there's going to be like 10 of us if I'm lucky. So I was very happy that 85 people took the time. So thanks if you were one of those 85. So they did the demographics, they did the BFI, they did the student professor rapport scale as well, although we ended up not using that because it's just too vague. We were just trying to get a sense of everybody's feeling about how they got on with students, but like I said, we didn't end up doing anything with that. So then we linked the ID number. So if Melissa was ID number 22 and she was linked to this student who said, oh, Melissa's my favorite, then I know, okay, I'll take Melissa's data and stick it in my file along with that student's data. So now I can compare all the professors' personalities and answers with all the students' answers. So BFI generates a lot of data. Like I said, there's 5 subscales. There's an overall score you can calculate it, but it doesn't mean anything, so we didn't. And so for every person in the study, we figure out, okay, on each of the 5 dimensions, which way do they lean, right? And so we figured out what the cutoff score was. A lot of those were published in the research about the measurement we used. And say, okay, this person is agreeable, that person is disagreeable or is antagonistic, and so on and so forth. We also looked at each person's scores across the board to figure out, okay, what is their primary presenting trait? What trait do they score the highest on? And we calculated those. It says relative score there because not all the subscales had equal numbers, so we just did, I forget how we did it right now. I think we did it by average score. No, that doesn't make sense. Oh, percentage. We did it by percentage. So here's how we broke out. 41 of us were named as favorites only. That's pretty cool. Of the 85 who responded. Only 24 were named least favorites only. I mean, somebody has to be the least favorite. It was curious to me that the difference was that much, that there's a lot of debate about who their favorites are, but there's a set of people they really don't like. Or those are the people who responded or didn't. Interestingly, and this is what we were really curious about, 20 people were named by some students as favorite and by other students as least favorite. So that's what we're looking at there. So the way I choose to look at this is, hey, 61 people are favorite professors. That's pretty good. So the easy analysis first, if we looked at the professor-student rapport scales as filled out by the student for their favorite and least favorite professors, we find, unsurprisingly, that there's higher rapport with the professors they picked as their favorite. That's a bit of a no kidding response, no kidding analysis, but it's still, we want to do that because as we found later, what we expect based on theory isn't necessarily what happens. But it's always nice to get statistically significant results in psych research. It's somewhat of a thing. My wife is in pharmacy research, and we talk about, there's only what percentage standard deviation here. This is great. And she's like, oh yeah, we had a 0.02 standard deviation. I'm like, well, we never see something like that in what I do. So a result like this, even though it's something obvious, still makes us a little bit excited. So let's look at the personality traits. Wow, that graph is so tiny on the screen. It looks bigger on my screen here at home. Anyway, the top student traits, they think well of themselves, mostly emotionally stable, which is the purple area over here. Introverted was second with the red. Lacking direction is the green wedge. Conscientious, see, that doesn't really surprise me. Students, especially a lot of them are trying to figure, I don't mean that negatively about students, but they're trying to figure out what they want to do with themselves, right? And depending where they are in that journey, they might feel like they're lacking direction. Conscientiousness was the yellow. They thought they had a lot of that, and openness and neuroticism were on here as happening a lot. Openness is the light green, and neurotic was the pink. And the others, well, you can see them there if you can make that out. So, there's that interesting data. As a professor of our students, the emotionally stable thing surprised me. But maybe that's just my students. I don't know. People are drawn to psychology for a reason, right? So here's what got people riled up. And by people, I mean professors. Let's look at the traits that we all have based on who is picked as least favorite. Again, that's 40, I just lost the number. The 20, I think it was 24 who were named as only least favorites, and then the extra 20 who were named as both. So there's 47 people here. And they were really neurotic. Well, that's not fair. That's misleading. Most of them scored neurotic as their most prominent personality trait, right? We don't know degrees of neuroticism based on how we analyze this data. You have to figure that out by talking to them. Lacking direction was really high, or that being the opposite of conscientiousness or the other end of conscientiousness. And interestingly, extroversion came up a lot, which was surprising, right? Because we look at the research, and extroversion is the orange on this wedge here. Because the research out there says, students like extroverted professors. But according to how this data shook out, that's not what it seems to indicate. And we'll get back to that in a couple minutes. So our favorites. Oh, this will be better. Wrong. We are so friggin' neurotic. So this is 80, I think it's 81. No, I'm sorry, 61 professors. The 41 that were named as only favorites and the extra 20. Again, overwhelmingly neurotic is our top personality trait. Extroverted shows up again, but also lacks direction and antagonistic. So like, you look at these and they're the less desirable characteristics other than extroverted, but still these are named favorite professors. And so we looked at these and we recoded the data. We're like, this has got to be wrong, especially me. I'm like, we can't all be this neurotic. I cheated a little bit. I looked up my own result. I came back as neurotic, so I'll tell you that. But that we had coded it correctly after rechecking it several times. Maybe that's neurotic, rechecking the data. This is how it came back. And so we were pretty confused because, while, of course, research doesn't always follow the theory, it tends to be a little bit closer than this, especially when there's so much other research behind it. But we soldiered on. And again, remember, no fewer than 4 people at the Day of Scholarship looked at me. Some of them were sarcastic. Some of them were quite serious. I'm not neurotic. Well, I don't know about you necessarily, but many of us are. But the students like us anyway, so there's that. They picked us as favorite, not just like us, but picked us as favorites. And it wasn't like the comments were like, oh, I kind of hate everybody, but this one I hate the less. No, there were some pretty glowing comments for the favorite professors. Excuse me. So we went forward with our analysis, compared professor personality to student personality in all kinds of different ways. We compared it to working relationship in all kinds of different ways. And all of the stats stank. Nothing came back as statistically significant. And for us, that's a p-value of 0.05, meaning that the chance that the results are due to error is less than 95%. Try again. The chance that the results are due to error is 5% or less is what we shoot for. And we weren't even close, man. This data was all over the place. And that could be due to a bunch of different things. One I look at is that internal consistency problem, that people were not answering these questions as consistently as we'd like to see in survey research, which maybe the questions weren't so good, or people were feeling conflicted about where their personality was or how the questions were phrased. Now, the survey, the BFI, is a good survey. It's been used a long time. It's got good psychometrics, but that doesn't mean it performs well with a given population. Maybe that's what happened. Also, there wasn't a lot of variation in the top traits. Like when greater than 50% of the top traits were neuroticism, it's tough to make any kind of meaningful comparison because you have so much weight on that one trait when there are, in the way we coded it, 10 to choose from, high and low on each trait. So that was sad, and we felt bad for a while. We're like, well, this didn't go the way it's supposed to go. But again, perhaps this is neuroticism. I prefer to call it stubborn. I said, well, let's keep looking. Right. So this is the data up to this point that we presented at Day of Scholarship. And then after that, in the next semester, we started digging deeper and say, hey, let's look at all these comments and filter out all the mean ones, because there were some mean ones and we just ignored those. And let's look at, well, we filtered them out after looking at them and deciding, okay, is this indicative of a personality trait or not? Right. So we developed a detailed description of each bookend of each of the 5 dimensions and said, okay, we're going to code independently. We're going to work on our own and code every comment as to the one or two personality traits it represents. And so after doing that, we got back together, we compared our results, again, some more Excel sheet fun and some basic stats, and went through and found that we agreed a lot of the time. And for the times we didn't agree, I think our inter-rater reliability was somewhere in the 80s. Again, we shoot for 90s for inter-rater reliability percentage. So for the ones where we disagreed, we had discussion about it. We consulted the research and came to agreements on how to code each of those. So for the favorites, there were 258 different comments that were coded. That's different comments. So again, some comments received more than one code, but 258 different comments. 210 different comments that we were able to code for least favorites. There were a lot, I don't have the number here, a lot that just weren't codable by personality. They were about other things like, this class is hard, this class is easy. I don't like their accent. I don't like their hair. That one was, well, I mean, all those were real. So again, stuff that is just random. Well, not random, but just not personality, and maybe more indicative of the student than the professor. And so looking at this data, how does this shake out based on who's favorite, who's least favorite? That really opened the window to being consistent with what the existing research said and helped us make sense of some of the data. So let's look at what people said about our favorites. So we went through, and for all those comments, okay, how did we code these? So for our favorites, and these are pretty much all, I think anything below 1% I didn't write down here. But of all the comments, 68.9% were coded as agreeable, right? So the favorite professors are rated really high by the students on agreeableness. Now that doesn't necessarily, and we did look at it, it does not relate to what we actually answered, what our own personality is as we see it, but that's what the students perceive. Emotionally stable is 14%, conscientious 8%, extroverted 5%, and openness 1%. I was surprised that openness was so low, but again, this is coding comments where we didn't ask what about your professor's personality makes them your favorite, but just what about your professor makes them your favorite, right? So it was very, very broad. And still we were able to develop these codes. So I have some quotes for you because we all love quotes. So here's some examples of comments that were written about favorites that we coded as agreeable. And I made sure as I selected these that these were coded as only agreeable. There weren't any secondary codes here. So this one, she would help me inside and outside of the class whenever I needed it. She was kind and taught in an enjoyable way, right? So there's that kindness, there's that helpfulness that all encapsulates this idea of agreeableness. Approachable, smart, funny, takes time to get to know his students, right? There's the leaning towards is engaging, forms a relationship, cares. That's all part of agreeableness. Some examples of comments that we coded as emotionally stable, down to earth, very experienced. That idea of down to earth came up a lot in the student comments, as did looking at the other ones, as did approachable. That came up a lot as well. Her personality and easygoing nature and the way she makes a hard subject enjoyable. Right. Again, naming the personality that it was easygoing, that easygoing part, the hard to rile up, the consistent part of that. That's how we code that as emotionally stable. And I give one conscientious example here because I ran out of space on the slide. Understanding, takes the time out to make sure you understand the material, down to earth, wise. Not saying that probably got coded as agreeable as well because of the down to earth comment. But again, this idea here, taking time out to make sure you understand, right? Really trying to make sure that the student gets it as best they can is what was named in a lot of the comments. So that's fun. Now let's look at those of us that they don't like. So 53% of those comments for least favorite professors were antagonistic. And I'll share with you some of them, but the ones I didn't share, ooh-wee. 24% lacking direction, so kind of chaotic in the classroom. We might look at that. Only 14% were comments about what we coded as neuroticism. So that's interesting given how neurotic we apparently are. 6% closed. And this one I threw on here just because I wanted to, even though it's below 1%, almost 1% introverted. And then conscientious I threw on there because I wanted to. I forget. Well, because it was weird. I was surprised that and this honestly is just one comment, and I didn't write it down on this presentation, so I don't remember what it is. But it was strange to me that somebody who was named as a least favorite professor got a comment about how they were conscientious. And so it was probably like one of those backhanded compliments, like, "Oh, this person is like a giant, terrible idiot," but you know they care. So let's look at some examples. For antagonistic, some of the comments we saw, wants you to fail, is not approachable, not helpful. Again, that adversarial thing, oh, they want me to fail. Now, I hope that there's not a professor out there that actively wants their students to fail, but that's how the student perceived it. Not approachable, not helpful. Not approachable, I can certainly see, and that gets that personality. Not helpful, I hope that's perception, not reality, but you know, we don't know. Condescending, patronizing, confrontational, isn't reciprocating in his demand for respect. Again, that adversarial stance is what students noticed about this person, or that student noticed about whatever person they were talking about. And I don't know, by the way, I don't know who any of these comments are about, because you know, when we put it in by codes, as soon as all the data was together, I got rid of all the code numbers, so I could stop cheating and looking at what people said about me, and that I wouldn't know what they said about anybody else. The lacking direction, I just have one example here because it was all around this similar theme. They're spaced out, forgetful, forgets the goals of class, goes off topic, fails to explain correctly. Kind of the I don't know, I find fewer and fewer people know what this means, but kind of the space cadet mentality. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar. I've had to explain it to more people than I thought I would, but just kind of being kind of out there, not really focused, that idea of chaotic classroom. And neurotic examples because, not because it's the most common answer, but because our actual answer came up as so neurotic. These are the comments, the kinds of comments we coded as neurotic. Very angry at times, can blow things out of proportion, arrogant attitude. That arrogance and anger is what really got us there. Narcissistic, rude, ignorant, apathetic, harsh, cruel, and mean. We coded this person as antagonistic as well. The narcissistic was largely what got this the neurotic code as well. I'm going to open it to comments, kind of looking at your comments, to your questions, looking at how this data shook out, and any response to these comments that the students made so far.
Hey, Matt, it's Cynthia. How are you?
Oh, hi, Cynthia. I didn't realize you had joined.
Oh, I had computer troubles. So sorry, I was late trying to get it all sorted out.
That's right. I won't judge your personality based on it.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question. Did you match, maybe I missed this in the beginning, but did you match if a student said they had a certain personality with the professor's personality? And if there's any correlation between those personalities, picking a favorite or a least favorite?
That was the big deal we expected to find, and it just didn't correlate. There was nothing there.
Right, because I could have two students in the lab, and they're talking about a certain professor, and one would be like, that's the best, it's my favorite. And the same person will be like, oh my God, I hate them.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. That was
they're talking about.
That exact conversation was why the student wanted to do this research. And that's what we expected to find, because the logic is there. It would make sense that your personality as a student affects what you'd see as a strength or a weakness in a professor. That's what we expected to find, and it just didn't shake out. All the stats on that were just garbage. So now I wouldn't give up on that line of inquiry. I think there's probably is something there, and maybe we just have to come up with a better way of assessing it. Maybe it's that the big five isn't the best way to conceptualize that. I don't know. But certainly, and given all the time in the world, it's something I might investigate more. But yeah, Cynthia, that's exactly what we were looking for, what we expected to find, and we just didn't find it. I'm going to share a couple other things, and we'll get towards more general questions at the end there. We'll talk about some implications. And the big takeaway for us is that maybe the most important thing isn't what our personality, the professor personality actually is, but what we project, what the students perceive that to be. And to Cynthia's point, we expected that, but we expected the students' personality to impact how they perceived us. And while I'm sure in reality that is happening, our data don't show it. And so I can't draw that conclusion from our study. But that idea that it's our perceived personality rather than our own self-reported personality, that makes a big deal. And in a way that makes sense, right? Because there's how I feel, there's how I think of myself internally, and there's how I act. And to a certain degree, I'm sure we all have kind of our professor hat that we put on when we're going into the classroom. I had a friend in grad school who had what she called her professor shoes. They had a big heel that made her a little bit taller, and it helped her feel professional and present herself in a way that she wanted to, right? And so that kind of stuff, and I'm sure a student, I really like the professor's shoes. We didn't get comments about that, thankfully. But that kind of thing, the way we hold ourselves, the way we project ourself as professor, is what matters more so than internally what's going on in my head, how am I feeling, how do I perceive myself. Obviously, these are exploratory results. I mean, it's largely a qualitative analysis. We can't draw a ton of conclusions here. It's something that certainly would be interesting to continue studying, to get at some of this nuance, and again, to what our initial goal was, and Cynthia's question was about, to saying, well, how does the student personality matter here? Like, what makes it so that we could look at that professor who has whatever personality, and it's my favorite and your least favorite, right? We didn't come up with a good, solid, rigorous way to make sense of that. I also would like to see, and we didn't do it for ethics reasons because it's hard to get grades, and for the difficulty of assessing learning across such a broad swath of students that were all taking different courses in different subject areas. So we didn't affiliate this with your grades or learning. We didn't ask in the survey, what grade did you get in that person's class? We talked about it, but again, because grades are FERPA information, even if the student gives it, we decided just to leave it off to make the ethics review a little easier. But that's something that should certainly be added, because, you know, if, oh, you're my favorite professor, but I did poorly in your class, or I hate you, and, you know, is that why I got an F, or because, you know, do I hate you because I got an F? You know, that's a whole other study. So practical implications, what does it mean for us? Like, for those of us here listening to this, thinking about, oh my gosh, what list was I on? Am I neurotic? I don't know. How we present ourselves, this idea of, and I'll go back to this idea that self is the professor. How do I see myself as a professor? How do I see my abilities, my efficacy, my confidence as a professor, and how do I project that to my students? What are the values I have as a professor about the role as professor, about what I think interaction between professor and student should look like, and how do I live that in my classroom? That's what students notice, right? Years ago, I think I was not long out of grad school, and I met a friend of a friend, and he found out I was a therapist. He said, "You can't be a therapist. You're too freaking sarcastic." Yeah, that's not false. And when I have my therapist hat on, I have a different filter than when I have that hat off. And when I have my professor hat on, I have a different filter than when I have that off. And that matters. How we present ourselves matters. And that is pretty much the takeaway from the data we have. So that, sure, maybe 60% of us are neurotic. I mean, it makes sense. This is a weird job we have in a weird environment. And this was before this data all predates the pandemic, remember? So God only knows what this survey would look like today. Most of our students notice something else, right? So you may be freaking out inside, but if you present something that the student values or notices more, that's what they remember, and that's how they form this impression of us. And so, you know, for us as professors in the classroom to really be aware of how the student matters. And for me, this loops back to the idea of therapeutic working alliance, right? The most important thing I do as a therapist is form a good working relationship with my client. You know, there's lots of different theories of therapy. I can do one of those and I can do it great, but if I don't have a good relationship with my client, it's not going to work. I could have a good relationship with my client and do the theory I choose and maybe make some mistakes, and it'll be okay, because I formed a good relationship. A lot of these same concepts apply to us as instructors. I can go in there and I can be the smartest person in the world about my subject. I could know the thing I'm teaching like the back of my hand. But if I go in and I'm kind of a jerk, my students aren't going to learn as much. They're not going to be engaged. I'm going to follow up on that in a minute. In a minute, I mean right now. My hesitance here is I don't want to give the impression it's like, oh, just do whatever you can to make your students like you, because that's not teaching, honestly. And certainly it's not what we want to do. And in our job, we are going to have students who don't like us because we have to set and maintain boundaries. And we have expectations for rigor in our classrooms that are important, that we need to have. And just sorting through without worrying about coding them for personality, sorting through comments made about favorites, there's a theme of really respecting professors that balance that rigor and what I'll call approachability. And I have some comments about that on the next page. I want to highlight this point at the bottom. Highlighting on my screen, you can't see that. Highlight this point at the bottom before I move on. Being easy doesn't make us the favorite or least favorite. Like, there were favorite professors like, oh, this professor was easy, and we expected that. But also on the least favorite list, too easy came up a bunch. Doesn't make us work, which was pleasantly surprising to see. So again, this is not about being easy. This is not about go up there and be a clown so people laugh. It's about forming a quality relationship and showing your engagement with the student and you're caring about their learning and caring about them. And so this balance of rigor and approachability, I've got a bunch of quotes here I'm going to share with you. These are often favorites. Witty, approachable, but still encourages critical thinking and hard work. He was passionate about the material, made sure that everyone had a good understanding, was easy to approach, talk to, and work with. Tests and homeworks were challenging, but not too hard. They were pertinent to the coursework and had obvious purpose. Right? The student doesn't, I want to say, doesn't mind being challenged, doesn't mind that the work is hard, but that the work was hard is something they were valuing. Right? That's the point I want to draw out there. She honestly cared about my learning. She took the time to teach me and had patience when I made mistakes. She challenged me but supported me at the same time. Again, in therapy we call it an empathic challenge. I'm here for you, but I'm not going to take your crap. I love this comment. I have some guess. I try not to guess about who these comments are about. I have some guesses about this one, 3 or 4. She tells you how it is, but wants you to succeed. I kind of wish that one was about me. He pushes me to work harder, does not accept subpar work as final or finished. He assigns enormous amounts of work, which only pushes me to put in my best effort, even though it is stressful and time consuming. I have never worked harder or been more enthusiastic than when in his class. Now, I read that and I wrote it here in this presentation. I'm like, this is probably more about this student than about the professor. And then I stopped and like, well, yeah, of course, it's about the student's mindset. That's important. And also there's a professor on the other side of this that has that challenge, that expectation of rigor and hard work, and encourages and I don't want to say inspires because that sounds tacky, but brings out the work ethic in at least this student, to the point where they named this person above other professors, right? So yes, it's the student, and also it's what we contribute, whoever this professor is, how they contributed to the students' experience in their classroom. So that's it. I'm going to stop talking. So as I've said before, I can't tell you what your scores were. I've deleted all that information. I don't know what your primary trait was. I don't know if you were a favorite or least favorite. And if you have to ask about your personality, it was almost definitely neurotic. But that's just a guess. I don't know that for sure. I'm not analyzing you. Questions, comments, suggestions for better pictures?
Hey, Matt, it's Brian. I showed up a little late.
Oh, Brian's here. All the negative comments were about you, Brian.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to know, am
Yeah.
I a good professor? Can you
No.
tell me? Can you please
No.
tell me?
Everybody hates you.
But I was curious, is there a correlation, or did you study anything between, this field and say other fields, right? Because the high percentage of neuroticism, is that a quality of us pretty stable human beings, or is that a thing that kind of runs across a larger swath of the population, right? Because there's like the psychopath test, which I acknowledge is like pop psychology and not great.
The
but
worst kind of pop psychology.
Right, but it tried to analyze like CEOs, right? So I'm wondering if there's any actual data that's done by, actual psychologists on that.
I am sure that data exists. I don't have it in my head. We didn't, because of a small sample and because of easy identifiability across departments, we didn't run any analysis of, which department has the most neurotics in it, which, I mean, of course it would be your department, Brian, but no, we didn't look at that across field. We didn't compare to any population data. Again, largely because we are a small school, and if we drilled down far enough, because I did ask for student majors, we didn't ask for what class they took, where they named people, but we asked if it was a major or minor class or other. But it was just, there would have been too much risk for identifying, even amongst the student and myself, who was being talked about. So we didn't drill down to that. I'll say that it would not surprise me that if we looked across, a more national sample of instructors in higher ed, to see that we might trend high on neuroticism, because we need to have some of those traits, right? We need to be detail oriented. We're evaluated in a lot of different ways. There's, all the anxiety that can come with, being on the tenure track or not being on the tenure track. For those at published or parish type institutions, there's a lot of pressure put on that. So just speculating, I would say that I would expect high neuroticism in our field in general, but I don't have any data in my head or from the study to back that up.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Matt. Really interesting talk. Thanks for giving it this
Sure,
morning.
thank you.
You know, it's got my mind spinning. I don't even, you know, I just kind of came off mute so I can talk a little bit. But one of the things that sticks out to me is you're saying, and I think even highlighting through the results that, you know, it's not really who you are or who you think you are, but who you play in the classroom, you know, and it makes me think a lot about the fact that I divide myself so many different ways. I have a role here in Philadelphia, kind of in the academic and museum communities here. I have a role at the Wagner Free Institute of Science, and one at the Academy of Natural Sciences, and one at DelVal, and one with my family, and one with my friends, and one, you know, when I'm here by myself. And, you know, each of those people that I'm playing are so different that I sometimes like think maybe I don't even know who I really am. Like, am I all of those things? And, you know, and I think if you were to ask me point blank about who I am and get me to talk about my personality and fill out a form about it, I feel like I would choose the worst of all of them and put that down.
Yeah.
And, you know, and because those are the things I think need the most work, and the things that I think about the most, and the things I put as the most effort into changing. So is, you know, in this sort of self-evaluation, is that a concern that it's like, you know, do you need to kind of read between the lines to figure out who somebody really is, or, you know, or are you concerned that when someone fills out a form like this, they're more likely to be self-deprecating than not?
Actually, I'm more concerned about the opposite. What
Really?
we find in a lot of social research is that people will tend to give what they perceive to be the socially desirable answer, right? So if I'm taking a personality test and I feel crappy about myself, I'm more likely to respond to what I think is overly positive to make a good image of myself than to really put myself down. But yeah, the interesting stuff in what you're talking about really gets to some of the, I'll call them debates in social science, is to really know somebody, I need to talk to them, right? Yeah, not like as a therapist, of course, because that's what I do. But I can't give you a survey or a battery of surveys and get your answers to say, well, here's the kind of guy Jason Downs is. Right? I have some ideas about how you perceive yourself, and one of the limitations we have to accept in psych research is especially survey research. We only ever get A, how people perceive themselves, and B, how they choose to share that with us. So you said so much there. I want to make sure I don't forget anything. I think just as you were kind of running through the different hats you wear, I think that that's something that is prevalent in academics, right? A lot of us wear different hats, you know, as instructors, researchers, you know, the different roles you have. I have the hat of a therapist and whatever else it is we do that isn't at all related to our careers, but are just different things we do. And it's a lot. You know, one thing you said stands out to me, and I think it's important. You say, you know, that we play the role we play in the classroom, or who I play in the classroom. Oops, sorry, train of thought derailed. This is a huge thing, because this is something I talk about with my counseling students and the people I supervise towards their license all the time, is that the ideal is that who I am when I'm wearing my therapist hat is who I am when I'm not. The way I say things, how I filter myself may change, but how I present myself, who I am, how I express myself, ideally will be pretty consistent, because people respond to genuineness, right? And genuineness in therapy is one of the foundations of good practice. So what I'd say, kind of in response to that, is what I'd encourage of all of us is to, yes, have your professor hat. We need to wear a hat. I guess this year we need to wear a mask. Literally, Carl Jung, oh, he'd be so happy. And also make sure that it mostly looks like you.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, you know, because like I also would have this concern of you know, being disingenuous if everything is a performance. You know what I mean? It's like, if everywhere I go I'm performing, then like I would worry that people would start to see me as a phony. And I think
that's
that
what happens.
And I think that if someone were to kind of stop and think about an interaction with me, like they would see who I really am. And one aspect of this is that I'm introverted. There's no question about it. I mean, and I've kind of looked into what that really means, and it really does apply to me. But you know, when I'm asked by one of my organizations to go to a social event and be social, I can be the life of the party, right? But I think that if afterwards you kind of talk to everyone that I interacted with, and I'm working the room, I'm talking to everyone, I'm trying to make everyone feel relevant and important and all that kind of stuff, and ask them like, hey, who is that person? Like, who is Jason Downs? Like, what did you learn about him? I think they would all say like, nothing. You know, like
I have appointments available, Jason.
I should stop talking.
The bad news is I don't take our insurance.
Right.
Well, I think you're hitting at a lot of important stuff here. Like, so what you're describing, and I'll admit I'm probably projecting because this is how I see myself, is what we call an extroverted introvert. Like, you can go and you can do the party. We can be in the classroom and do our thing in the classroom, and go home or go back to our office and just go, oh my God, I'm so exhausted.
Right.
Just want to take a nap. Like, it's draining, but we can do it. We can turn that part on.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean it's fake. It doesn't mean that's not who we are. I mean, sometimes we got to fake it, right? Fake it till you make it. It's one of my other lines to a lot of people. Does somebody that you're networking with at a dinner party for work need to know, well, who is Jason Downs, right? What is the goal, or what is the point of being there? Now, if that's what you want, sure, then that's important. But if you're like, I don't actually care about these people, and I'm here to do my job and to, you know, advocate for X or Y or Z or get donations or whatever the point of the thing is, that's okay. That's good enough, right? But it's tough. It's tough to figure out, okay, who am I really when we wear all these different hats, which is you know, the oh my God, so tacky, but it's the process of it. It's the journey of it. It's like, all right, who am I, and who am I today? Who do I want to be tomorrow? Right? How do I want to keep that the same? And that's important too. What do I want to keep? What do I want to stay the same? What do I like or value about myself? And what do I want to address or change or work on? And it's a never-ending process. It keeps me employed. But yeah, I think you get at a lot of it. And my encouragement to us thinking of our roles in the classroom is to be as genuine as possible. Students respond well to that. Some of the comments I didn't share with people today really came down to what students are saying as treating us like people, which I imagine, again, this is pure speculation, is a response to kind of that phoniness that you were talking about. Like, if it's always performative, it comes off as fake. Or if I'm nervous about if I really am having some neuroticism and I'm trying to distance and present this image of myself as the all-powerful professor, well, that comes off poorly. And probably isn't who we really are, but it's a response to our nervousness about being in the classroom or our self-doubts. And a lot of times out of fear of screwing up. And I don't know about all of you, but I screw up at least once a week in my class. There are a couple of days where I sit there, I look at a PowerPoint slide, I say, the thing that's on that slide is exactly wrong. Let me fix it. So, and you know, for me, part of the way I do it is I let them see me make mistakes and fix them, right? Because I don't need them to think I'm all knowing, right? I need them to engage in a process of learning, and I've got to show that I also engage in that process. So that's a long answer to an important and difficult series of questions.
Oh, that's
I don't know if we addressed any of them or all of them.
No, thanks, Matt. And
Sure, thank you.
Sorry for taking so much time, but
Oh, that's all right. I
it's
like this
really
stuff.
helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Matt, one of the things that strikes me is that it'd be interesting if you could go back and look at cohorts of students too and their impressions of faculty members, because it's always impressed me that I can have multiple lab sections. I feel like I'm doing the same thing in each of those lab sections, and in one you'll get an evaluation in which you're something of a godly figure, and in another lab, which you thought you were doing the same exact thing in, you probably have no business being in a classroom at all.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think we've all gotten that comment at some point. That I think is a really interesting point to look at, kind of the social psychology of it, or you know, how do groups of students perceive you? And one thing I'll talk about with my wife or with friends is you know, some years I have a fan club, like a group of students who are friends that you know, I'm the one they picked. And I imagine, you know, the rest of us have had that experience somewhere or another in some way, shape, or form. What is it about that? You know, what is it for those students that are like, oh my God, I am both proud and embarrassed by this. I had a cohort, a fan club that called me Papa for a while. So, you know, what about my interaction with them elevated me in that way? Whereas there are other people in that same class. I mean, our department is small, so I have a lot of the same students multiple times, which I think is also important. Yeah, but some of those students hate me, right? So why is it? We're looking at personality. It's doesn't mean it's not personality. I don't want to throw that idea out. But what else could it be? You know, is it, you know, the time of day I had that class? Is what meeting do I come from before I go to that section every day? I mean, is it something that's me, that's environmental rather than personality? Or in psychology we call it state rather than trait, something that just happens, or something that's who I am. Is it something about them? And of course, as with most things psychological, the answer is all of the above. We just got to figure out how. A lot of times, honestly, what classroom am I in? Right? Like, I love y'all in Mandel, but your classrooms are crap. Like I love that hallway though, the classy room, the classroom. I love the signs. Hate the rooms, especially in the fall semester when it's so freaking hot in there. I hate those rooms, and that probably comes through in my presentation, my attitude, how much I'm sweating in class that day, and it probably comes through in theirs, and then that bounces off each other. Yeah, it is a complicated thing that we try to simplify sometimes, because to account for every possible variable would definitely make us neurotic. So I think those are important questions, Reg. It's certainly something I want to dive more into. You know, what are the other factors? And I think that's especially relevant, not just who do you like or who do you have the best relationship with, but how do you learn, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, our role isn't to make friends, it's to help people learn. And so how is our relationship contributing to that? We see that clearly in the therapy world, and that's my corollary here. And I think we got to continue doing research in the educational world. And they do that a lot in K-12. And of course, in K-12, the interaction with students is a lot different than it is for us. And gosh, more power to those people. I couldn't do that. But I'd like to see more of that at higher ed, especially at a college like ours where it's small. And I don't know all of you, but I imagine, you know, we're small enough that you have the same groups of students, the same individuals, the same cohorts multiple times. You know, I teach, in a typical year, I teach at least 4 required courses. So I get most students 3 or 4 times. That's probably different than you know, the person they have once. Or, you know, those of you teaching some of the core courses, the writing, the math, where you get students once, maybe twice if they're taking 2 levels that you teach, and then they're off. You're not in their field. I mean, now that being said, I didn't put this in the presentation, but people weren't always picking favorites from their departments, right? So people that teach only the service courses got named. People that teach only electives outside of departments got named. It wasn't predictable like that, as I, again, suspected it might be.
Hey, Matt, have you ever read anything on performance theory? I mean, I know
No.
there's one in, there's a version I think in psychology, maybe I'm wrong on that, but there's certainly one in literature. It builds off of, oh, what's his name? Victor Turner and Judith Butler's works. But one of the things that they talk about is we're performing in at least two ways anytime writing's involved, which I would imagine a survey would include. But and I've certainly had that moment before when I've been asked something, I start answering it, and it's not unusual to kind of assume a voice in my answering, right?
Yeah.
So how I'm doing my response to a particular question takes on a voice, a performance there as well. And I'm often looking, I don't think necessarily consciously, but I'm looking to make my response uniform. If I'm angry, then it's like a sort of angry uniform response.
Yeah.
If I'm, you know what I mean? And there's this idea that within a particular bit of writing, we assume roles as well. I don't know how that would play into what you're doing, but
I think that would fit really well. I wrote that down. I'm going to try to look it up. And of course, in typical professor fashion, you saying that made me think of something else. And I'll throw a little bit of communication theory at you. I think this is Bateson, but I'm not confident in that. That in every statement we make, oral, written, whatever, there are three types of communication, right? There's, I'm sorry. I mean, that's true, but that's not the point I want to make. There are three messages that we send outside of the content of what we're actually saying. One is we're sending a message, this is how I see myself. The way I, whether we call it perform, Brian, which is kind of what got me thinking this way. How I'm presenting myself in a classroom or in this Zoom call or in whatever interaction. This is how I see myself. The second thing we have in all of our communications is this is how I see you, whoever we're talking to, an individual, a group, whatever. And the third one, which is my favorite one to say, this is how I see you seeing me. I can tell you've read this before, Brian. And I think that really gets at a lot of this, right? My nervousness that comes out, my confidence that comes out, that's about how I see myself. The way I interact with students. And this is something I teach in class, and so I give lots of examples. Like, I don't know about all of you, but I am a wanderer in the classroom. I walk around, which is another reason I hate those Mandel classrooms. There's nowhere to go. And one thing I try to do is I try to make eye contact with all of my students, unless there's one I know hates it, and sometimes even then, with all my students at least once in the class to try to keep them engaged. All right, so I'm saying here, I'm presenting myself as a relatively confident person, as somebody who's comfortable doing what they're doing. How I see you, I want to engage you. I see you as I don't want to say equals, because I think professors that say, oh, I see my students as equals are full of shit, because it is by definition a hierarchical relationship. But I see you as valuable individuals, right? I don't see you as less than me. I see you as just as worthy and just as worthy of respect as me. And so in the way I interact, I project that, how I respond to questions, how I respond when I get frustrated by them, which sometimes I fail at, which, because also human. And how I see you seeing me, the response I anticipate from you, how I phrase things. As I'm sure you all do, my syllabus grows a little bit each year. In my head, I have new rules I create that are named for past students that made me create the rules. And I share these rules with students, and sometimes they're very stupid. And they look at me and I say, well, if I ever say a stupid thing to you, just remember it's because somebody made me say that to them in the past. Right? How I see you seeing me. I know that this sounds stupid. I'm not trying to talk down to you. And also, this has been a problem in the past. And so the way we hold ourselves, where we stand, how we interact, that presents a lot of this stuff. And that's, we're drifting here because that's getting a little bit less connected to personality. Obviously, it's all interconnected. Everything is interconnected. But that's more about this, again, not knowing the theory, but more tied to this performance idea that Brian's talking about than necessarily what is my personality. Yeah, thanks for that, Brian.
Thank you.
I think there's a study to be done here. I've abandoned a lot of social media because it pisses me off every day. But one thing I like to follow on Twitter is Room Rater during all these Zoom calls, and just looking at this. And I'm Brian, you're big on my screen right now because you're the last person who talked. And I'm having this thought of, well, let's apply this communication stuff to how we set up our Zoom rooms, right? How do we dress? What is our background? Like, there's the genuine Brian sitting in his office. Look, we got there with his Buddha in the background, the Buddha by the printer. It's nice. Be one with the inkjet. And you've got me, I've got this background I've hung from my ceiling to try to make it more therapeutic when I see my clients, right? And I've got a button up now, I'm just wearing shorts, but you all need to know that. I'm presenting a certain image, a little bit for you all because I'm presenting today, but mostly for my clients. Because there's an image of professionalism I want to project. We all have different ways of projecting that in our classrooms, of what we decide is the right level of professionalism, and how we dress, how we interact, the language we use, the language we don't use.
Is this because I made chili that one time while Zooming during class?
I mean, I wasn't there, but I mean, I often do ask myself, what would Jessica do?
That's
Okay,
a bad.
don't do
the
that.
opposite.
And
yeah,
do the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that raises an interesting point. I'm hesitant to unmute. I'm at my brother's house, and my 4-year-old nephew might run in and say any number of things at any moment.
That's okay.
So, just so
That's
we're
fine.
ready.
I enjoy that. I also enjoy pets.
But Zoom offers another interesting layer, because why someone, and we think of this with our students too, why they're muted or why their camera is off, often reads as apathy or not being engaged, but it could be because they have family in the background. It could be because, when you're at home, multiple things are happening at once.
Right. Or it could be like an issue of class. Like, we see all of our backgrounds, and, a lot of the backgrounds we see are, I don't want to say well-to-do, because I know we all get paid, but financially comfortable people. We're largely not struggling with poverty. We're largely financially secure compared to many. Our students aren't necessarily that way, right? And so is there shame in the background? Would they be ashamed, or would they be embarrassed to show what their living situation is like? And you're absolutely right, Jess. We make the assumption of disengagement, of they're not paying attention. And of course, sometimes it's that, right? But sometimes it's not. And this is getting to, I guess, my values as an instructor. I'd rather get fooled by the weirdos, huh? I'd rather get fooled by the dishonest than to not take somebody with a more genuine concern seriously. And that's a value I take, and I'm sure I've been taken several times on issues like that. And frankly, I don't care, because I know sometimes it's been the right thing for a student who needed it. But that like, I have that value. I can afford to have that value. And, we can get into so many other things there, the way I teach, what I teach, gender, ethnicity. Like, if I am a woman, if I am a person of color, I don't have as much leeway, I'll say, to say, okay, it's okay for me to trust this student. And that's something I learned early, man. I went to a big D1 school for my doc, and a lot of my friends in my program were women from other countries, and the shit, as we were learning to be teachers, the shit they had to put up with in the classroom, nobody would even dream of doing in mine. So yeah, that's unfortunately for them, fortunately for me, a lesson I learned early. But again, comes through in my personality, right? I go to what students call us a lot. And I expect undergrads to call me doctor, right? This is something I expect in my classroom. I want to encourage it. Sometimes people don't. I was like, yeah, y'all know. Sometimes they don't. It would be wrong to say I don't care. I do care. I don't care to make a fuss about it. I'll often correct them. Honestly, I'll correct them more when they screw up other people's. But I can afford not to care. Right, because it doesn't change how they take. I don't see that as this student doesn't take me seriously because they called me Mister. But that's into social position. Look at me, just looking at you, Jess, makes me talk about social position and gender.
My work here is done.
You're so subversive. To be fair, I always think about it. I just wasn't talking about it. But it ties into all this, right? Because how do I present my personality?
Well, and to go back to Jason's point too, right? Like, how often is shyness misread as snobbery or disengagement?
Yeah.
But if you are introverted, Or if you have to be social on that day, you're struggling to work the room, and you're like, come on, be pleasant, be pleasant.
Right.
And people think you're unpleasant, and you're fighting that fight.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot, like, so often we'll talk about introversion as this terrible thing. It's not a terrible, I don't know where that came, I mean, extroverts probably is where it came from, because they're very uncomfortable with introverts, right? But this is a strength. Like, there are a lot of things that you benefit from by being introverted. You know, thinking back, I guess this doesn't really prove the example, but just in talking about it, I'm thinking of, Jason, of your laundry list of roles you play. Maybe you're more extroverted than you think, because if you were more introverted, maybe you wouldn't take on all those roles. Like introverts can say no. Maybe we don't. Again, academics and the pressure of you know, being everything to everyone. Maybe we don't say no, but there's some protection that comes from being introverted, just as there's some protection, some benefit that comes from being extroverted, and it's important that, you know, for ourselves, wherever you fall in an introvert to extroverted spectrum and these other traits, that's okay. Be who you are. Use who you are to your advantage. Again, things I say to my students, things I say to younger professors and adjuncts that I'm mentoring is, you know, okay, you've got the people you looked up to, but don't try to be them. You got to figure out how to do it for you. Like, I like the way I teach, I like the way I do therapy, but I don't want you to do it like I do it. You got to do it like you do it. That's that genuineness piece again. If you're going out there trying to be me, you're going to fail. Doesn't mean you're going to do a bad job. It doesn't mean anything, but it's not you doing it. It's what Jason talked about of this, what do you call it, the role you play, or the performance aspect that Brian talked about. The more consistent you can be, here's who I am, and that's how I present myself as an instructor. Awesome. That's what's important, and that's all we can go from.
Matt, I missed the beginning. I had to help my dad out, but since you had brought it up when you were talking to Jess there, I was curious, for the least and most favorite professors, how much of that broke down by gender, ethnicity, the people of color who were professors scored worse? Did anybody with an accent score worse?
I can't give a confident answer to that because of how homogeneous our sample is. Because, I mean, let's all sit around and count the 2 black professors on campus. And obviously diversity is more than black and white. We all know that. But in terms of looking at the initial data set, who was named, even that is so overwhelmingly white in both categories, favorites and least favorites. There's nothing worth saying there. Of course, yeah, people of color were named as favorites. People of color were named as least favorites. There were comments that mentioned accents negatively. There are comments that I know are about Jess because, oh, they talk about sex and gender all the time. I don't actually know that you're about you, Jess. I just assume they are. They could be about, you know, somebody else. So, I mean, the short answer, Brian, is no, I don't have that information, but we know from existing research on, you know, student-professor relations. We know from looking at people's student evals and just understanding implicit bias and racism that, yeah, that plays a role. But in terms of showing numbers for that or data out of the study that has something to say about that, our sample is too white to make any kind of meaningful comparison. So boo for statistics.
Well, given the pause, I'll take the pause there as an opportunity to say thank you to Matt for not only a great seminar, but then this really great discussion that I've been enjoying. I know I now feel like I'm going to go read my student evaluations this afternoon.
Oh, don't.
Kidding.
You know, actually, sorry to cut you off, but I can tell your ending, and I want to say this. I expected the worst when I got to reading some of the comments on this study, because I'm like, this is going to be like evals, except more anonymous, because they know the professors aren't going to read them, and it wasn't as bad as I expected. So I don't know what that means. Maybe it means they want us to read the nasty things about ourselves. But yeah, but also, like, you know, Don't let the haters win when you read your evals, folks. They're just cranky.
It's the timing of those things, right? At the end of the semester. All right, well, thank you all, of course, for attending, and especially thank you to Matt for sharing with us today. We do have another seminar coming up on July 30th, if anyone wants to tune in. That's 3 o'clock in the afternoon with John Urbanchuk. So until then, everyone, stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we'll get to see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Matt.